Deep in the nation's remote northwest, pristine escarpment country rich with life, and an isolated town in the dark grip of a crisis. It's another busy day at the health clinic in Timber Creek. The small clinical team here is tasked with keeping vulnerable Indigenous patients safe across an enormous stretch of the outback.
Let's pop into my office, we'll just have a quick look at those.
Katherine Drummond has spent more than a decade as a nurse in the Territory's most remote corners. But when she treated a woman who'd been attacked by her partner shortly after beginning at this clinic earlier this year, she found herself standing at the coalface of a terrible dilemma.
I had nowhere safe to then take her. And this was a woman in crisis.
Despite being the heart of a vast region linking the East Kimberley to Katherine, there's no women's shelter for hours from Timber Creek. Rates of domestic violence are on the rise. The service gap leaves its victims with nowhere to turn.
It potentially looked like we were going to have to return her to her home because she couldn't identify anywhere else that was safe. And that created some stress for me. I had long conversations with the police about what is this going to look like? Is this a safe option? And I don't think it was a safe option.
In the nearby community of Mayat, many of these homes have become overnight safe houses for women escaping violence. Lorraine Jones started out as a young community police officer here in the 1990s. Back then, she would deal with violence by day and take victims into her own home by night.
With all the victims that were coming through from communities, that I used to put them up in my house, and before they get transported out to Katherine, or, until they were safe enough.
Her sister Deborah says little has changed in the decades since. Both women say the practice is exposing children to violence. They worry it has lasting effects.
Try and explain to the children who's the victim is, where they come from. And, the kids would ask, question, what are they doing here in our house?
The Northern Territory continues to battle the nation's worst rates of domestic violence. In a population of fewer than 250,000, police responded to 5,500 domestic violence-related assaults over the past year alone. 9 out of 10 victims are Aboriginal. In Timber Creek, a dire situation is getting worse. Officers responded to about 11 domestic violence call-outs in the 2018-19 financial year. That figure more than doubled to 24 in 2019-20. In the sparsely populated region, it then rose again, ballooning to 41 incidents. It then dropped slightly to about 33.
Most of the communities that are not dissimilar to Timber Creek would have access to a service such as a safe house. And certainly the statistical data broadly would suggest that one would be of value in that region, as it has been, as they are in other regions.
From Katherine, Superintendent Kirk Panuto oversees police officers from the Western Australian border all the way to the Gulf of Carpentaria. With no domestic violence shelter to turn to, his small team in Timber Creek sometimes has to leave the town to transport women in crisis to a shelter hundreds of kilometres away. Nurses also embark on the journey, leaving the community without key frontline services for entire working days.
From a policing perspective, the moment you get that incident, you can be assured that the rest of that day is gone.
The federal government has provided tens of millions of dollars in funding for shelters in about 16 communities across the NT over the past decade. But it's the NT government that chose where they were built. The Northern Territory Government Department responsible for domestic and family violence said where shelters go is based on several factors, including the ability to attract staff and overall rates of violence in the region. That department said the government already funds a domestic violence coordinator here in the Timber Creek region, and that person is supported by services in Katherine, as well as a women's shelter hundreds of kilometres away in Kununurra. According to the local council, domestic violence rages on while governments pass the buck.
You can only write so many letters, to all these ministers, but it doesn't really hit them in the core,
And then we thought, well, we just got to accept it. And we don't need to, we don't have to, we don't have to. We have a right, a human right, to live a safe life.
The Northern Territory's Domestic Violence Minister says there's just one thing stopping immediate action.
To set up a service in Timber Creek, and of course that would be an ideal outcome, and we'd like to do something like that straight away, you actually need funding, and that's why we are calling on the Commonwealth to assist us.
The question of funding has been thrust into the spotlight in the wake of the deaths of at least 2 Indigenous women and an infant in suspected domestic violence incidents in July alone. A domestic violence survivor herself, Kate Warden, says the incidents show there's a long way to go.
To all of the women in Timber Creek that require services, yes, we will continue to look at it, and we will make sure that we continue to talk to the Commonwealth Government about making sure that the Northern Territory has adequate funding going forward.
The federal government fast-tracked more than $10 million in domestic violence funding for the Territory days after a version of this story went to air. But there's still no guarantee it will find its way to the region.
And we've been asking that, for over 20 odd years, and we're still going. And a lot of family are still catering for the victim, like shifting the victim to another house for a time being, and then you're putting yourself at risk.
We're losing people. People are dying and committing suicide, and we can stop that. We need someone to give us the tools to live a happy life, safe life.